Natalia
Still great,
Krestovska,
Andrew.
are you there?
You would expect me to say now it's a privilege to be able to speak to you, and it is. But while people often say that, they rarely say why it's a privilege. And I want to begin by saying it's a privilege because the work you're doing, and I'd like to think the work that I do, is essential to bringing a new world into existence. And that is something which is extremely important under the present circumstances. I'm not going to be talking today about mediation techniques. There's a great deal of wisdom that you will get over the coming days about mediation techniques. And I mediate quite a lot, and I have my ideas about mediation techniques. But mediation techniques are not going to be what gets us where we need to go. The question is, what will get us where we need to go? And I was interested when I was asked to speak today about the title of my talk. I want you to know I did not pick the title of my talk. The title of my talk was given to me. And when I looked at the title, leaving aside the question of my being inspirational, the question I had, which I would like to think is the question you had, is what does it mean to come up with orbits of understanding? What are orbits of understanding? I've been thinking about that since I was given this topic on which to speak. And it's, I think, important for us to step back just a moment and do some hard work together. Those who know me know that I don't like speaking from prepared remarks. I do not. People know I do not like to sit still. And this is as hard for me as anything right now. I may actually stand up at some point. The reason that's true is that I think of these opportunities as conversations, and I'd like to leave some time at the end where you have some questions. It's my hope. But I also would like to say that one of the reasons that I like to walk around and one of the reasons that I like to have conversations is that I think that's the only way that we actually enter into the worlds of other people. I think the question that I focus on more than almost any other in all the many things that I do is what is the geography of our lives? What is the geography of mediation in one part of my life? And so I thought about this topic, the orbits of understanding, in a geographic way. Now, what do I mean by that? I think that our lives have various orbits. We all understand what those are in some ways, but in other ways, we ignore the differences of them. So when I was a very young man, young boy, I grew up in a very small town. And a town was small enough that I knew everybody on the street, even when I was very young. I could go into anyone's house. I knew what troubles they were having. I could have dinner there. I could actually even stay the night. My playmates were in those houses. Everybody in the street knew one another. Everybody understood their problems. And everybody also understood something very important. And that was that their own self-interest was very deeply tied to the self-interest of everyone on the street. And in some ways that was true because I lived in a little town where the soldiers had come back from World War II and they had shared a very terrifying and difficult experience. And so they understood each other in some very deep ways and what they had experienced. That's not dissimilar to a lot of places in the world right now, including Ukraine. There is a shared experience being developed that actually is very unifying. But in my country and in all countries or all places where that kind of unity develops, it is almost inevitable that it erodes. It is almost inevitable that people move away, that people travel greater distances. And that first orbit of their lives, the orbit that is personal, the orbit that is immediate, the orbit that is present, becomes an orbit that is distant, becomes an orbit that is farther away. And that's a lonely place. It's a place where people struggle to be seen. It's a place where people really want to find some way to connect with people. And at least in my country, and I think it's true in many places, what has happened as a consequence is that we have moved from the personal orbit to the orbit that is based upon group identity, often ethnic, sometimes religious. It can be based on politics. It can be based on a number of different things. This is what we like to think of and often characterize as cultural, but it's actually quite different than being cultural. It has cultural components. It's important to be sensitive to it, but it's also true that it is a struggle by individuals to actually find some place to connect to the world. And that's, I'll call it the second orbit, that is the orbit of our lives, can be quite destructive. It can be an orbit that separates us. It can be an orbit that makes it increasingly difficult for us to find common ground. Then there's another orbit, and it's the larger orbit that actually brings me into this room with all of you today. That orbit is an orbit that is the world at large. It's the world that I inhabited in the diplomatic space. It's a world where I met people from, countries across the world and helping them with their problems or trying to. It's an orbit that actually is not as personal as we think it is. And we sometimes forget that, in fact, our troubles and our problems are every bit as important, and not only that, connected deeply to the orbits of people in other parts of the world. So here I am speaking to you today. I'm in Chicago today. I travel around the world pretty constantly, and that's why my background isn't as pretty as some of yours. But I am a great distance from you, and so the question then is, how can I speak to you in any way that is helpful? I mean, that's my goal. My goal is not to simply say things that I find interesting. My goal is to try to be useful to you. That's what Louisa and the organizers wanted me to do. So that third orbit is an orbit that is absolutely critical to our well-being, increasingly critical, I might say, because of all the challenges that we have that don't have any borders. The troubles in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, which I've focused on quite intently for some time now, carries all kinds of challenges to the rest of the world that we well know, some of which are not being very actively discussed. Food, for example, food prices, for example. So that third world, that third orbit is another way of looking at how we are in the world. So there are other ways of characterizing these orbits, but the issue ultimately then becomes, well, what's it understanding? Orbits of understanding. What are we trying to understand? And why are we trying to understand it? The truth is that many people aren't trying to understand anything. They are hiding behind their identities, they're hiding behind their communities or whatever, in the hopes that they won't have to deal with problems, that the problems will pass them by. We are not among them because we're here having this conversations. So what does it mean to understand something? And that's where I really began to think about the topic of this talk, and how I could give you some very practical ways of thinking about this. I sometimes do talk about culture, by the way, and I sometimes do talk about mediation techniques, but I will tell you that I don't want you to confuse what I'm saying with culture. I'm going to talk about something that is more purely physical. It is geography. And I've written some things on the geography of empathy and why empathy really is increased with changes in our geography or our perspective. So I'd like to go back and just tell a personal story, which is kind of a fun story for me. When I was very young, the first time I was out in the world, I had my orbit. The first time my orbit was a world orbit. I was 20 years old and I was living in Athens, Greece. And it's probably the first time I really fell in love, which is, of course, the first orbit, and very intensely the first orbit. And one thing that we did is we walked around Athens all day and night together, not knowing what to do. And for reasons that I don't really know, we tried to find where we thought Aristotle's Lyceum was. Now, for those of you who don't know what Aristotle's Lyceum was, you know Aristotle. Aristotle established a school and that school had been lost. No one knew where it was. This is 1971 when I was doing this. And the school, by the way, was finally found in 1996. We thought we could find it. We had various reasons why we thought we could. We were wrong. That didn't matter. What is important and why I raise Aristotle right now, and this is going to seem quite strange to you, and we're going to think that this ultimately is not relevant to what I should be talking about today, is Aristotle's school was called the Peripatetics. In English, peripatetics is probably similar in your language, means walkers, people that actually walked into the world to understand it. Aristotle was very focused on geography. He was very focused on being present. He was very focused on the world around him and seeing it clearly. And of course, that's why Aristotle developed the scientific method. So Aristotle was one of the first, not the only one, but one of the first to think about how you enter the world in order to understand it. Now I'm going to bring this to mediation in a moment, but I want to take a small detour to talk about someone else, which is a fellow that some of you have actually heard me speak about, I suppose. I sometimes talk only about him. His name is Leon Battista Alberti. And in the middle 16th century, he wrote a book called On Pictures. And what Alberti did was think about how to paint with perspective. Alberti understood that the way that painting had existed in the past did not provide the perspectives that people really needed to see the world clearly. And so what he did was actually describe and demonstrate, how do you paint with perspective? And the way Alberti talked about it was interesting. He talked about it in terms of entering into the worlds of others. What Alberti wanted to do was actually draw the viewer into the canvas, into the picture. And he called that empathy. Now, we've thought about empathy since as being an emotional thing. We think about empathy the way our German friends sometimes talk about it philosophically. Empathy became something that was, to be empathic is essentially emotional, not physical, not geographic. But Alberti understood that actually it was deeply geographic. And it didn't really stop there. I mean, and I will not go into great detail on this, I promise you, but the whole effort now by physicists to look at quantum mechanics and space-time is all physical. It's all the proximate, how particles, how bodies are proximate to one another, how they affect one another in ways they don't even begin to understand. Now there's since we're talking about walkers and walking into the world and seeing the world clearly, putting yourself in a position to understand who you are dealing with and why. You can live in any country you want to live in, and I have done it numerous times, and trying to understand someone else's culture is a very hard thing. But one-on-one, being with someone or being with a small group of people does not, in my view, require cultural sensitivity as much as it requires geography and being present in the same space. And so what we try to do when we are in that space is to find the common ground that exists between us. There's a few other quick things that are quickly relevant that I'll just mention. One of the great stories about walking that was ever written was James Joyce's Ulysses, in which the protagonist, as some of you know, walked around the city of Dublin for a day. And in Ulysses, what Joyce said was the shortest way home is the longest way round. It takes a long time to come to the physical space that you need to occupy. And going to our German friends again, Martin Heidegger said that what we try to do when we do that, and this is really critical, what we try to do when we enter the world of someone else is not to bring our world into it. In the case of Odysseus, not to come back to Ithaca and find the world you lost, to find the world that was once there. It's to create a new world. Odysseus, when he arrived back in Ithaca, was a changed person. Everybody on this screen, everybody in this call will be a different person in the coming years as a consequence of the struggles that we're going through. This is particularly true of our Ukrainian friends, those who are in the middle of all this struggle. So the question isn't, you're not going to recover the old one. You're going to need to find the new one. And in that sense, what Odysseus did when he arrived back and fought the suitors and recovered his world was to find the new world that ultimately he was prepared to find. Now, that process of finding the new world is deeply, deeply a physical process. Why is it hard? This is the part that is so problematic now. Our so-called leaders, political, religious, secular of all kinds, are doing their best to try to prevent us from connecting and finding the common ground. They are exploiting identity. They are finding their core or their base groups. They are using those relationships with their core groups as an expression of power. They are providing a huge amount of disinformation. They do not care about common ground. What they care about is winning. Now, I will say that going back to our orbits for just a moment, when I was young, living in that small town, we weren't trying to impose our ideas or our views of the world on one another. We were in a conversation with each other every day. It wasn't until we actually moved away and found ourselves more distant from one another that we ultimately began to find reasons for disagreement. Now, there's many reasons for that. Most importantly, it's fear. Because if you live in a community and you have people around you, your fear is less than if you live by yourself and are isolated. And so people find strength in the identities that people give to them. This is made, of course, much worse with virtual reality and with social interactions being had on Meta and other places where people ultimately never meet each other. I have been mediating over the course of recent years on Zoom, which I find not only unsatisfying, but and while I've been successful in almost all instances, it's not the same process, and it's wrong to think of it as the same process as being present with someone else. And so that physical reality actually has the deep roots I suggested. It's Aristotle, it's Battista Alberti, it is space-time and quantum mechanics. It is, and I could go down a much longer list as to why the actual entering into the world of another is so critical to this entire process. But people, when they get frightened, want answers quickly. The process I've described of entering into someone else's world is essentially a legislative or a deliberative process. It is a process where I would sit with all of you and we would talk about what's the best thing to do? What do we base that upon? What's the science behind it? Have we researched all the right things? Now, we're trying to come up with an answer to come up with a world that we ultimately think is peaceful, sustainable, and the like, and prosperous. But that's not what's happening now. What's happening is all of the things that ultimately would allow us to deliberate, that would encourage that process, are problematic for those who are, quite frankly, autocrats, dictators, people who ultimately want to impose their religion or their beliefs on someone else. As a consequence, all the forces, or many of the strongest forces in society, are taking us apart at the very time when we need to find a way to create the conversations to come closer to one another. The question then becomes for all of us and for anybody else in this process, what do you do in a world where most of the forces are taking you apart in order to essentially work together to create the new world that we need? What is that process? And I'll be frank, we've been flailing around. We've been creating interest groups. We've been creating groups online. We've been trying to find newspapers that are more reliable. We've been trying to do all kinds of things. But I think that the thing that we need to concentrate on is taking every opportunity to connect with each other physically. and be present. It's a shame that I can't be, we're not all in the room together. If we're in a room together, what I would be doing right now is not standing on a stage behind a podium, not standing, a distance from you. I would be walking around, among the tables. And it's not a parlor trick. It's not something that I do in order to, because I don't speak from prepared remarks and I walk around. I do it because it's the only way that I can show you my vulnerability, my desire to connect to you, and read what it is that you find that's important so that we can come up with an answer together. But what's happened instead is the identity politics of the day. And this comes into the room in mediations. I want to stress that. This is not some broad political reality. When the political reality goes towards populism, which it is, then the political reality of trying to manage conflicts essentially mirrors that problem. And people feel less inclined to find common ground. Now, on the business side, that's not as big a problem as it is on the geopolitical side. And one of the challenges that we have, I'll just give you a very practical example for a moment. Those of you who've read anything that I've written may have seen that I talked about diplomats being the wrong people to negotiate peace treaties. Now, this is counterintuitive. People think that's their job. But the problem is that diplomats have people back at their capitals that essentially want politically to achieve something. And so they don't try to achieve all that they need to achieve. Ceasefires are the principal thing that they will begin with. And very often they'll stop there because they don't want to fail. The diplomats personally don't want to fail. And the leaders that have sent them into the field don't want them to fail. But more troublingly, diplomats rarely, if ever, negotiate peace treaties in the places where the wars or the conflict is pending. So they'll go to Geneva, they'll go to Paris, they'll go to Dubai, and they'll pretend to have a peace conference without ever having been present in the places where people have suffered. They won't do it in Gaza. They won't do it in Ukraine. They won't do it in South Sudan. They won't do it in Myanmar. And that's exactly the place they should be doing it before they basically pretend as though they have any kind of solution to the problem at hand. Now, you might achieve a ceasefire, and which is a good thing. Don't mistake me. It's unquestionably a good thing. But it is not the thing that brings you the long-term peace that you need, because you've never entered into the world that you needed to enter into. So I argued for actually approaching peace negotiations in a very different way. People who are deeply informed about the plight of the people in harm's way, people who are actually present in those places. And the basis of my thoughts of that is not because they're smarter or because they're better mediators, but because they don't have the limitations that ultimately politics and others impose upon them. And they also are prepared to be present. Anybody that is trying to be of any assistance, even including myself right now, by the way, should be where you all are, and it wasn't possible today given a variety of things, but that should be the way we look at it. And yes, there's a risk associated with that, but I think that's ultimately a critical thing. But instead, what we have is people who want immediate answers or immediate solutions, and so they don't deliberate. It's called instantaneous democracy in some ways. It's not really deliberative, doesn't involve legislatures. It's involved somebody like Donald Trump saying only he can fix it, which we know is ridiculous. And we know it's ridiculous, not even if it were somebody who was more capable than Donald Trump, which is not hard to imagine. Almost everyone is, in my view. But the fact is, Donald Trump anybody thinks that they're the only one who can fix something really has missed the understanding how critical we are to one another and working with one another in order to achieve a result. So as a consequence, the real issue is, how do we, all of us, how do we deal with this reality, and how does it come into the rooms where we are present? We're not negotiating. I'm not negotiating a peace treaty in Myanmar. I wish I could, but I'm not. And so the issue is, where am I encountering this? And I know this seems like it's an overstate, but the very way that people are being empowered by the societies behind them to think of themselves as being separate, to focus on only their identity, to focus on their self-interest as though no one else nobody else's interest is important to them, empowers them to come into a room and makes it much harder for mediators to actually function and do the jobs that they need to do. If I am faced with a group of people that has been essentially told that what they are doing is appropriate by a government, for example, getting them to do anything that actually says, I understand your situation, I can find some common ground between myself and you, becomes exceedingly difficult. Again, I'm not talking about really a lot of disputes or don't fall in this category, but the diplomatic disputes sure do. And so mediation techniques in diplomatic disputes are critical. But the fact is, it matters who's actually in the room doing the negotiation. So what do we do? I mean, how do you change the reality on the ground? How do you come, if you're Ulysses, how do you come back to the world that you thought you knew, the world that you thought was the world that you were working to achieve, and find a new world that ultimately is actually better, but more achievable? And I think that the first and most important thing is to actually be there. Years and years ago, there was a little book written by a fellow named Gonzalez, and Gonzalez's father had fallen out of an airplane from 25,000 feet and had survived during World War II without his parachute opening. And Gonzalez, and he almost every bone in his body was broken, and he was wired together in a prisoner of war camp with coat hangers. And Gonzalez asked himself the question, why did he survive? Why did he live through that process when others did not or would not have? And so he did a study of all kinds of natural disasters, wars, sailboat accidents, skiing accidents, hiking accidents, mountain climbing accidents, you name it. And he talked to the people who survived. And his takeaway after he did all this work, and there was 50 or 100 of these, many of which are famous accidents. And the takeaway that Gonzalez had was put in one line, which was be here now. Be present. Be there. Don't bring into the room something that you think would have saved you, that you think would have been what you needed, the skill you needed in order to survive. Gonzalez concluded that everybody who tried to do that, who tried to bring into the room, who tried to come back to Ithaca, for example, and basically bring all the skills that you thought would be important, if you brought those into the room, you didn't survive. If you looked at the space around you, you did. And so that's why I said what I said about cultural sensitivity. If you come in, I spent my time in a lot of different cultures. If you come into a room and you think you understand, in my case, the expressions of Islam in Indonesia, and I think that I can be sensitive to my Islamic friends in Indonesia, my Muslim friends, is I'm dead wrong. And there's no way I can understand that. But what I can do is be present with them in a way that ultimately helps them explain to me what it is they need and why they need it. So that's one thing. There are other things, however. We need to create a narrative that our self-interest is connected to the self-interest of others. Now, we say that, it's easy to say that, but the reality is that we are connected in ways that we all absolutely understand, but we cannot allow ourselves to be separated by those whose interests it is to separate us, which is generally politicians and others, to try to say, you're right and they're wrong, and we're going to reward you, but not them. Because at the end of the day, that breaks us all apart in ways that are very destructive. We need to pay a lot of attention to that first orbit of what it was like in a world where we really were physically connected in those kinds of ways. Now, the other thing that I think, one other thing that's important is we tend to focus on rights as human rights. It's human rights and the like. I tend to think about it in terms of the competition of ideas. I just want ideas to compete. I want there to be enough justice in the world so that people's ideas can compete. And then we see what happens. The problem becomes, no, you can't have the competition of ideas. And of course, politicians and others are very much against that in this time, it seems to me. And so the question is, competing ideas are another way in which we can essentially get closer to one another, because everybody's ideas ultimately get expressed. Then there's something in the United States that we call, and I think you probably call it something different other places, third places. Third places are places that aren't home, they're not work. They're places where people come together and ultimately spend time. Third place, for example, one of the famous third places in the world would be British pubs, places where people actually gather. We increasingly aren't doing that because of cell phones and computers and the like. There's an effort in my country to try to reestablish third places, because third places are places where you actually spend time with other people. And in Southeast Asia, when I spent so much time with so many others, I'd often have people tell me foolish things, things they believe that, quite frankly, there was no reason for anyone to believe. And there's several ways to respond to that. But the way I came to respond to it is, I'd really like to understand what you mean and why you believe that. And of course, it's very difficult for people to support foolish things, often is. But if you're in the right place, sitting in British pub, for example, or some other kind of third place, tell me why you believe that. It's something that's quite powerful. Now, going back to our Greek friends again, Heraclitus said something in Works and Days, which is really enormously powerful. Everyone wants to be seen. And in third places, that's where we see each other. At work, we see a coworker. At home, we see a brother or a spouse, partner. But out in the world, we see a person that is separated from those emotional or those employment connections. And that is a powerful place to be. And so the idea of seeing one another, going back to the first orbit, is something that provides a perspective in which we understand that our self-interest is tied to the self-interest of others. I mean, it's easy to say, and I have written on this as well, the self-interest of the world, most of it in my view, is deeply tied to what happens in Ukraine and what happens in Myanmar and other places. But yet the political discussion in many places is it's someone else's problem. And that's, of course, politically driven, in my view. Then there's another thing that we can sometimes do, which is we need public interest entities that will analyze situations and give us options or understand or express what it is that's happening. It's no accident that autocrats, including those in my country, are trying to destroy the press, are trying to destroy that dialogue and that discussion, because it's in that dialogue and that discussion that finding third places is made most possible. Because if at the end of the day, if you don't analyze problems objectively, if you don't get in a room or share space, share ideas with people, then ultimately you're just left to the things that you believe without any support. And that's, of course, very, very useful for certain politicians, and it's enormously destructive in terms of finding common ground. So we need to have some public interest force that I'll call it journalists. I think lawyers too, lawyers and the law that can actually say, no, this isn't the way it should be, and this is why. That's enormously powerful. I think that it's also true, and I'm going to finish with this because I'd really like to see if there's any questions after what I've said, is that peacemakers, all of you, need to understand at least what I'm trying to say, whether I've said it clearly or not. You all are going to be, some of you had better techniques than others. Some of you need some practical advice. Some of you have done mediation, few mediations. Some of you have done mediations in certain areas and not others. I'm not saying that technique doesn't matter. I'm not saying at the end of the day, you don't need all those benefits. Nor am I saying that, cultural sensitivity and all that is not relevant, because of course it is. What I am saying is that you need to understand all of the orbits that I've described and many more. What is it that ultimately you need to do to understand the world more deeply? Sometimes my friends say to me, why are you quoting the Greeks? Why are you quoting James Joyce? What about Martin Heidegger? Why? And the answer is because people have thought about this for a very long time. And they've talked about this for a very long time. We need to benefit from what they've thought. And we need to benefit from what they've written. And they've written things that are relevant to what we're trying to do today. And they provide ways for us to see it more clearly. I just go back lastly, because at the end of the day, I quoted Joyce, said longest way around is the shortest way home. And I've gone a long way around right now. I could have gone much longer. But at the end of the day, it's critical to recognize that the world that we're trying to bring into existence is not the old world that we had. It's the new world that we need. And at the end of the day, we have a real opportunity, given what we do, to bring people together and find those common spaces, to find that common ground, to do just that. And that is why it is a privilege for me to have the chance to speak with you. And that is why I'm so sorry I'm not in a room with all of you somewhere. And maybe one thing that we can do is commit to one another that at some point in the future, if we've done our job and things are going better than perhaps they are right now, we can share the space we need to really fully understand one another. I wasn't told how long I should talk. I've talked for 40 minutes now, and that's about, in my experience, the limit of how anybody can listen. Unless Louisa wants me to keep going, and trust me, I can. I'm happy. Oh, it's not Louisa. Louisa's gone from here, so I'm sorry. So anyway, I would love some questions, so I'll stop there. But thank all of you, and it's a deep pleasure and privilege to have had the chance to say a few words to you.
Dear David, I will help you with questions, but before we start with questions, I'd like to tell everyone we've just listened to a fascinating presentation from David Carden, who's a lawyer, diplomat, mediator, author of many publications, both in the realm of diplomacy and mediation. He represented US in Southeast Asia Association of Countries, and also ambassador, a partner in international law firms, and right now he's a mediator in commercial disputes in the US. He's also Weinstein International Foundation board member that provides training and supports mediation in non-commercial disputes. I do have some questions here in the chat, David. Alexei Zabchenko has a question. He's asking you to share your experience of serving as an ambassador in the Association of Southeast Asia Association. So if you could share that, and that's the first one. Let's take it one at a time, okay?
Should I call on them? Siddharth, want to start?
Sure, sir. Thank you so much for your wonderful suggestions, and especially I appreciate your philosophical perspectives and the way you put the geography of empathy into picture. That is something that I've never heard before. And from an Indian lens, because I belong to India, and I was able to understand the meaning of empathy quite deeply because we have that soft power in ourselves. So that was very nice to have in the session. And I would like to, my first question, I have two questions. I'll just make it as short as possible. My first question would be that you suggested a first-hand approach to actually solving geopolitical crisis or situations where people have suffered, rather than taking it to a neutral point of view, or rather than taking it to a neutral location where these disputes could be solved. You suggested going in there on the ground and actually solving these disputes. But what would you suggest regarding the ramifications that could follow, probably by the domestic government or the polities that actually structure these places? What would be the potential implication, and why do you think that this kind of a first-hand approach could work even in such turmoil?
What's your second question? I'll see if they pull together.
Sure.
I'm not sure I should
Miss-
allow you to ask a second question because there's a number of hands, but well, I tell you what, let's hold off and I'll come back to you. Let me answer this. I mean, I'm going to try to be quick because there are some questions out there. Years ago, I was asked by the World Economic Forum to give them some ideas as to how they might approach their membership. And what they'd done is they had established a mock refugee camp in Davos, where the members who attended the Economic Forum went through and saw how people lived in refugee camps. I mean, it was they tried to do it quite accurately. And what I was told at the time was that the members were emotionally undone by this, that it was a very powerful time for them to spend to see just how people had been forced to live. And then they got on their jets and they flew home. People don't know that the Economic Forum has programs all through the year and very few members participate. And the question they asked me was, well, how do we change that? I mean, how do we make it the case that the emotion and the effort to help and the reaction that people have has some continuation? And I had a long conversation with them at the time. I made some suggestions. It doesn't matter what my suggestions were. But I think that it is absolutely the case that with some exception, some sociopaths, and some leaders actually are sociopaths, but very many people that I knew in government would have reacted very differently in terms of what they did if they had been confronted with the reality on the ground. Now, there are challenges with that, some of which are security challenges, although I don't think those are very significant. And I think, and these processes take a long time. I've spent a lot of time in Vietnam, and I'm very fond of Vietnam and the like. And the idea that Henry Kissinger and everybody negotiated in Geneva around this special table that they had without ever having been there and seen just what had happened is ridiculous. And I think that at the end of the day, the only way we ultimately say, you know, this is just unacceptable. This is something that we cannot tolerate. And I think the peace that would come out of those processes would be have much more justice in them. I don't know that I've answered your question, but I think that we would have to feel our way as to how it would work. Nobody's tried it. Nobody's done this. And I sure would like to try to establish a process. And, you know, you could go back and forth. I mean, although in the case of, in my view, the suffering in Ukraine versus what's happened in Russia doesn't warrant a time to spend any time in Russia. That's not the case, perhaps, in other places where there's been problems across a border or within different communities, as in Gaza and Israel, for example. So it wouldn't be that you would wait it to be only in one place, but I would love to try a peace process where people think that, you know, what should happen in Gaza actually have to spend some time there and stay there, right? And not simply, you know, go back to their Four Seasons hotel in Tel Aviv. I would love that process. Afan? Afan, you have to unmute.
I think that is full answer for this question, and okay. I have some questions.
Okay.
For example, Alexei Zyapchenko asks about your experience of serving as ASEAN.
I'm not hearing you. It's breaking up. I'm sorry. My experience dealing, or that's all I heard. No.
Dosvid as an ambassador. As an ambassador.
You're serving as an ambassador in Southeast Asia. Can you share that experience with the audience, please?
As an ambassador to ASEAN.
Yes.
Association of Southeast
Asian Nations.
Asian nation.
What is the question?
Your experience of serving as an ambassador.
Do you mean just in very general terms, what it was like? Well, I'll tell you a quick story which may be relevant to today. So I was the first ambassador to ASEAN, and I was chosen for a specific reason, I think. But I was called into the office of somebody whose name you would know, not the president, but someone else. And I was told that when I went to Southeast Asia, I should find some things that I cared about, and I should have what was called wins, meaning I should go do some things that people could see right away were good things. And I said to the person who said that to me, I'm not going to do that. And they were surprised. And I said, I don't know what's important. I don't know what's important until I go there, until I talk to people. And what I think is important may not be what's important to them. And so I did that. And so one of the things that I did that I think, again, is relevant to today, to this conversation, is I was the first US ambassador in American diplomatic history to hire a science advisor who was actually a scientist. And we did all kinds of work in Southeast Asia based upon her work. So our approach was to be students of the region and then try to help in those places that we could. We weren't a big mission. We're bigger now. Although Trump will not send, in my view, will not send an ambassador there. Trump did not send an ambassador to ASEAN in his first term. I'm doubtful he will send an ambassador now. I haven't looked to see. Because he doesn't believe in multilateral conversations. And so we did. We created conversations across the region, and many of them took place in my dining room. So we were very collaborative, and we tried to be very informed about what the problems in the region were. Well, among other things, I'll just simply say one last thing. We tried to establish an early warning system for pandemics, where we thought that we could actually, for a variety of reasons, we thought we could get some early warning about a pandemic emerging. And we were unsuccessful, but we tried. And it's too bad that we were unsuccessful because we got COVID. I'm not saying we wouldn't have gotten COVID, but based on what we did, but we need that kind of system. Anyway, that's a quick answer to a question.
Thank you very much. And the next question from Dmitro Saryan. Mr. Carden, when the shortcomings of public politicians are so often pointed out, doesn't that take responsibility away from the people, voters, who elected them and put them in power? After all, mediation is, in my opinion, я би хотіла, щоб переклали перше речення. Давайте я його повторю. When the shortcomings of public politicians are so often pointed out, doesn't that take responsibility away from the people, voters, who elected?
The answer, I think, is to the extent that the elections were informed. One of the challenges we have is elections are never purely informed. I'll give you an example. 8 million people who voted for Barack Obama in 2012 voted for Donald Trump in 2016. The same people. Now, the desire for change is powerful, and anybody who promises change has, I think, in many instances now, real support. In 2016, Trump said he would bring manufacturing back to the United States. In my view, he lied about having done so. He didn't do it. It didn't come back to the United States. He's saying the same thing now. I'm going to bring manufacturing back to the United States. He didn't do it when he was president the first time. He said he did. And so people voted for him in 2024 on the basis he was going to bring manufacturing back. Well, is he going to do it or not? My own view is he won't, and doesn't have a lot of intention of doing so, with some exceptions. And so voters vote for things oftentimes in a very uninformed way. Now, that's democracy. Democracy's a mess. But it's one thing if the voters get it wrong based upon, you know, a collection of information that they don't have. It's another thing if politicians lie to them and spread disinformation and utilize the press or suppress the press in various ways. What are the voters voting for then? Is Russia a democracy because people vote? Answer, of course not. Are a lot of places that are democracies because people vote? No. So voting doesn't guarantee the voice of the people. Information and voting guarantee the voice of the people. And even then it's imperfect, of course. But the wisdom of groups that Aristotle talked about in the Politics, he said groups are smarter than individuals, required groups being given the best information they could have, not being misled or misinformed, which is what we have now.
My personal question to you. Diplomacy and mediation are different professions and even different callings. Is it possible to combine diplomacy and mediation?
I'm not hearing the question. I'm sorry.
Dear David, could you please choose English channel? It's
I'm sorry. I wasn't paying attention when you told me how to do that because I wasn't going to use it. So okay. Where is it? Where is it? Louisa.
Okay, no worries. It's just on the bottom of your screen. You need to see a globe.
I don't have it on the bottom of my screen.
If you don't have this globe icon, you could go to 3 dots and see interpretation.
I'm aware of the 3 dots, but I don't have that. Oh, yes, I do. I'm sorry. Yes, I do.
Now you could just choose English, so everything will be okay.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Sorry. Speaking English, I didn't think I would be needed.
Тоді я можу поставити запитання, так, українською мовою.
Well, in that case, let me ask you a personal question.
Okay.
Отже, дипломат та медіатор – це різні професії.
A diplomat and a mediator, they come from different professions. A diplomat represents the interests of the country. A mediator has to be neutral. Can you combine these 2 professions? Can you, in other words, can one person wear 2 hats, one of mediator and another one of a diplomat at the same time, simultaneously?
I think I would respond to the question. One of the famous descriptions of diplomats are people that are sent out into the world to lie for their country. The role of a mediator is obviously not to lie. I do not, by the way, always agree with the idea that mediators have to A, B, C, D. I don't agree with that, but I usually agree with that, but I don't always agree with it. And that's another conversation. But I think they can be combined for the following reason. It's a slightly different way of looking at it. I think mediators can accomplish diplomatic objectives. I don't think they do it by being diplomats. I think they do it by reading situations properly, by bringing as much knowledge as they can to a situation, and seeing how to find a common ground. That can have a diplomatic result, diplomatic with a small d. And but on the other hand, obviously, mediators do not function as diplomats. In fact, in my country, it's illegal for an individual to function in the world of foreign policy. It's called the Logan Act. So there's a variety of reasons for that are good reasons. There's some reasons that are not such good reasons. But nevertheless, John Kerry, when he was working on the client work, was having very honest, serious conversations, I think very informed conversations with a lot of people around the world. And he was accused by the Trump administration of violating the Logan Act. He didn't. But the reason I think that the Trump administration thought of it that way is they didn't want him having the conversations. But he was having very informed, very good conversations. And I suspect that there was probably a small d diplomatic result, where people did come to some common ground based upon conversations that he was facilitating. But it's important that we don't think of mediators as diplomats, but it's equally important to understand there may be situations where an informed diplomat, an informed mediator, could achieve an important diplomatic objective.
Thank you so much for your answer. Unfortunately, the time for this session is up. I would like to express my words of sincere gratitude to David for his fantastic and fabulous conversation, for the very honest answers to those very complicated things that we've been discussing so far. And of course, let me express my hope that we're going to have many opportunities, that at least online or much better offline, one-on-one, to be able to talk to you again. David, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. And, best regards and best luck out there. We have to do this together.
Я зі свого боку теж хочу дуже подякувати вам, Девіде,
I would
за те,
like to also express my gratitude to you, David, so that you discussed those different orbits. Now, we immersed into this conversation, and thank you very much for your unwavering support to our nation. Right after your words, after what you have told us very honestly about those very relevant things, we have a lot of intrinsic affinity, and we can feel your support. Thank you so much once again, and thanks very much to Natalia, who is trying hard to ask questions and translate some of those. Natalia is a doctor of science. She is a mediation practitioner and a great member of our team. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I said that right. Anyway, I tried to. Take care, everyone.
Дякую.